The Haunting at Buckwheat Manor by Norris the Pony. Beyond the town limits of Sundown, at the end of a long dirt road, lay Buckwheat Manor. It stood alone without peers, neighbored by the wild around it, paying host to no earthly chat, besides the calling of birds and squirrels in the forest around. Grass, vines, and fungi crawled up the sides of the ancient house, as though the dirt beneath was trying to reclaim the manor and drag it back into the quieted forest grotto it had been erected within. The air beyond the broken, rusted gate separating the manor from the road beyond felt cooler to Shady Fortune, as his hooves trod over the threshold and into the acre of property allotted to Buckwheat Manor. The trees above his head hadn't been pruned or cared for in decades, and they cast the clearing and the house within in shaded half-light, no doubt the source of the sudden coolness. Shady Fortune's rattling carriage shattered the stillness of the forest, birds going silent and settling down on the branches to look down at the lone earth pony approaching the manor for the first time in as long as the little creatures could recall. It had been a bit of a trek, reaching Buckwheat Manor from the town of Sundown, which, despite being the closest settlement, still lay a good 20 minutes trot from the manor. And that was without lugging one's earthly belongings behind themselves on an old, rickety carriage down a dirt road that surely hadn't seen regular use in decades. Hopefully, Shady thought, he could change that. He came to the front porch of Buckwheat Manor, the large plantation home now looming above him in all its decrepit disrepair. The shingles had faded to the point that they were unrecognizable from the stone foundation the manor was built upon. The windows were all boarded up, as were the double doors leading into the manor from the front porch. At one point, the roof had begun to sag, and one of the house's several chimneys had collapsed, and was now laying sprawled across the overgrown lawn. A prestigious mansion? Well, perhaps one day it had been. Now, though, it was more akin to a demolition job in disguise. Yet, it had been cheap, and Shady was, if nothing else, an ambitious stallion. He saw potential in the old manor that perhaps a bit of handiwork and patience might fully realize. He quickly got to work, shuffling out of the carriage harness and unloading his affairs from within. He left his blankets and clothing in the carriage, having resigned himself to the reality that, unless he wanted to share his cot with rodents, it would likely be a more private resting spot than the mansion itself at the moment. Besides his immediate necessities, he had only brought the essentials for the time being. Canned food, a camp stove, toiletries, and other amenities. Furniture could wait, especially since he'd yet to see within the manor itself to really tell how much he would need. Shady was still unloading his affairs when a Pegasus mare came flapping over the trees from the direction of Sundown, pirouetting down through the air to come to a rest on the lawn a few yards away from Shady. She gave a few quizzical, almost weary glances at the manor as she approached Shady, but still greeted him with a small wave of her wing. She had been the mare that Shady had been dealing with through his initial purchase of the manor, back at the town hall of Sundown. Sunny Meadow, she was called. Here she was now, right on time for the final transfer of land from public to private for the first time in 6 decades.
"Afternoon, Shady,"
Sunny Meadow said, still glancing half at Shady and half at the manor.
"I see you found it okay?"
"Hard to miss," he replied, smirking.
No kidding.
Sunny Meadow was already fishing through her saddlebags, withdrawing a few sheets of documentation and a ballpoint pen.
"Still not sure what you're thinking with this one."
"I'm thinking it's a damn nice house that just needs a bit of love," he returned, waving a huff. "Those the forms?"
"Yeah."
She passed them over, not taking her eyes off the manor before them.
"But seriously, this place doesn't give you the heebie-jeebies?"
Shady laughed. "No more than my granny's old place." It just needs some TLC. And if it's a total demo job, I'm still probably going to make a fortune off the land itself. What have I got to lose? Sunny Meadow shrugged.
Your bit's to blow, I guess. But I'm just saying, I wouldn't touch this place with a 10-foot pole. Some places are just better left to rot.
That's a city worker attitude in you. Shady replied with a grin, taking the forms and using one of his food barrels as a makeshift table to sign them on. How long's this place been sitting here, anyway?
Since it was built? Gotta be going on 200 now? Since any pony's been living here, 60,
She glanced at a few of her documents.
67 years. We come by every once in a while to make sure it's still standing and no pony's forced entry into it or whatever, but besides that, you're buying it as is. Rat-eating furniture and all.
Shady chuckled. What a steal. He hoofed the documents back to her. There you go.
Righto?
She tucked away the documents once again and offered a hoof, which Shady gratefully shook.
Well, you know how to get into town and all that jazz already. No mail this far out, so you'll have to collect that at the post office back at sundown. You want us to send some pony every couple weeks to check on you? You know, in case the rats get you?
Probably a good idea.
Gotcha. I'll see who I can talk to and to visit in this creepy place.
She snorted.
Well then, I think that about covers it, Shady. Good luck with this suicide mission.
She jerked her snout in the direction of the half-collapsed portion of the roof.
You know where to find me back in town if you got any questions. And I'll make sure Rickety Ratchet doesn't go trying to scam you on your supplies.
Shady said his thanks, and Sunny Meadow shortly thereafter took her leave, flapping her wings and disappearing over the trees as she made her way back into town. Alone again, he decided there was no time like the present to get a proper idea of what fresh Tartarus was ahead of him in the old manor. Grabbing a crowbar from the wagon, he started towards the porch. The old wood let out an indignant groan as his hooves stepped onto the steps, but it thankfully didn't collapse as he approached the boarded-up double door. The boards had been stenciled with large block letters. Danger. Keep out. He brought the end of the crowbar down behind the boards and, with a low grunt, wrenched them both off. The old screws gave way rather easily, and he tossed the boards aside and left the crowbar leaning on the porch wall while he fiddled for the manor's keys from his saddlebag. Bulky, ancient affairs, but the tumblers in the door lock had miraculously not yet rusted into oblivion. Gently, Shady pushed the double doors open and took his first steps into Buckwheat Manor. It was, indeed, still almost entirely furnished on the inside. It was the first thing he noticed, as he had to step over a shattered chandelier that had come crashing down in the foyer. Half of the glass had been splayed across the stairwell, which led both up to the second floor of the manor and down towards what Shady assumed was a cellar. He had the floor plan of the manor somewhere back in his wagon, but with the furniture still intact, it was quite easy for him to make out the purpose of each room on the first floor. Immediately to his left, a library and study joined into a living room, while to his right, beyond the stairwell, lay the spacious dining room and kitchen. With the windows all boarded up, it was dark within the manor, even in the midst of day, and so Shady's first order of business was to recover his crowbar from the porch and pry off the first couple boards blocking the many large windows surrounding the dining and living rooms. He supposed he could have just grabbed a kerosene lantern from the wagon, but he figured he would have to get to beautifying the manor eventually, so why not start sooner? Once the boards were removed, Shady could finally look outside the manor at the decaying porch surrounding it from every direction, and the gently swaying fence of trees that seemed to box in the house from all directions. They grew close enough together that, even in the light of day, one did not have to look far before darkness overcame them. Besides the thick coating of dust, which nearly gagged him on no rare occasion, Shady was quickly astonished at how preserved the interior of Buckwheat Manor truly was. Even the couches and love seats made of fabric in the living area hadn't eroded completely nor been devoured by rats and moths. Indeed, as Shady's exploring hooves took him around the first floor, he found little to no traces of animal life at all. The one thing he had been worried the most about on the way in, reclaiming the house from wildlife that had been given decades to take over, seemed to be evaporating by the moment. It was a strange thing, though. He was quite certain the house was not exactly airtight, and so he could think of no reason why it would be left alone by the woodland critters. Regardless, it had been. It was one less thing for him to concern himself with, and so Shady figured he may as well count his blessings. The old floor's creaking and moaning soundtracked his exploration as his hooves took him from one room to the next. He started at the dining area, which bore another smaller chandelier perched above a table meant for 6. The walls of the dining room had been painted with beautiful floral scenery, but time had been cruel to the surfaces they had been painted on. It lay partially in plastered remains on the floor and table, with the rest of the painted mural just recognizable enough to fill Shady with disappointment, knowing that he would have to tear it down. He very much doubted the original painter was still around for him to hire again, after all. The living room was a similar story, though there were a good number of surviving paintings that wouldn't need salvaging. They would, however, probably be relatively worthless now. They depicted the house's previous owners, presumably the Buckwheats, he supposed, who had apparently sold the place abruptly half a century ago and not ever returned. If there were any surviving members of the Buckwheat family, he supposed he could see if they wanted them. The paintings were, at the very least, quite nice looking. The largest of them depicted 4 ponies, an older mare and stallion, standing proudly behind their presumed children, a young colt, and a rather beautiful mare in her early 20s. There was a chance, Shady supposed, that at the very least the Buckwheat children had surviving relatives someplace. It was worth looking, he figured, before he used the old canvas for firewood instead. He proceeded to the second floor with caution, vowing to keep the undoubtedly insect-infested cellar for last. He wasn't necessarily arachnophobic, but the last thing he wanted was to begin his first day in Buckwheat Manor combing spiders and centipedes out of his mane. The stairwell leading to the second floor of the manor was just as daunting, though, with how loudly it creaked and groaned as Shady crept his way up. Fortunately, he didn't end up falling through them and taking an accelerated passage back down to the first floor. For all of its complaints, the stairwell seemed sturdy enough to support him, though whether or not it would support something heavier than him, well, that remained to be seen. The second story of the house was as dark as the first, but with less sizable windows he could pry open to let in some light. As such, he had to examine it in relative darkness. There were 4 smaller bedrooms on the second floor, as well as a large suite for the master of the house, and another on the opposite end of the house for the groundskeeper, if Shady's knowledge of the layout of old manors was to be trusted anyways. Tearing off a few of the boards revealed a balcony, which surrounded the front-facing wall of the house, accessible through an entrance from the master's chamber, and another at the landing at the top of the stairs. The bedrooms were, like the furniture on the bottom floor, surprisingly well preserved for having been lying in wait for 60 years. Without light, he couldn't really examine each room in detail, but at the very least, he was able to assemble some idea of the layout of Buckwheat Manor. Shady was practically breathing into a handkerchief by now, though, with how densely the dust hung over the air, churned up by his hooves and the movement through the dormant rooms. There was a smaller library and study on the second floor, too. Shady was only able to linger in the entrance for some time, though. The roof above had been the section he had seen from outside that had collapsed inwards, and the fireplace lay in a mass of bricks across the floor. The smell of rotting books was nearly overpowering, and so Shady closed that door and vowed not to open it until he'd recovered one of the ventilator masks from his carriage. Each room bore more paintings, some beyond salvage, but many still presentable, with a bit of restoration. The furniture was all the same Rococo design, which might have been garish nowadays, but Shady found it to be rather fitting for the relatively grandiose manor. He returned to the master chamber one more time before he made his way back down to his carriage. Tearing off a few more boards from the windows to let some light in, he vowed to make his call on whether or not he'd be staying the night within the manor itself. The dust was a problem, but not one he couldn't solve in the few hours he had left before sundown. He was not prepared to sleep on the ancient mattress of the generously sized king-sized bed, but he had taken along his own cot for that very purpose. It would suffice until the Pegasus movers arrived in a week's time with the furniture order he'd be sending in. Shady had been expecting so much less than what he had gotten on his preliminary examination of Buckwheat Manor. He had been expecting mounds of rat dung, furniture in tatters, a few angry possums snarling at him for every new bedroom he examined. And yet, if it hadn't been for the dust and the scent of rot in a few places, he would have felt as though he had just stepped in from 67 years ago to greet the Buckwheat family in the flesh. Night fell, and by the time it had, Shady had moved most of his affairs into the bottom foyer of Buckwheat Manor. The boards he had removed from the windows were stacked in a pile on the front porch, to be used as firewood to combat the coming autumn night. The windows that he was able to force open, he left open, at least during the day, while he worked diligently over the hours to sweep out the thick coating of dust. It wasn't exactly perfect come sundown, but it was significantly better than having to cough every couple of seconds. And with the coming darkness and cold, he knew he would have to conserve as much heat within the manor as he could. He cooked his dinner outside, on the camp stove he had brought in, having decided not to trust the wood stove in the kitchen to not flood the entire house in smoke. He did, however, risk lighting the fireplace in the library downstairs, which also made its way up through the master's chamber on the top floor where he'd been staying. A quick examination with his kerosene lamp confirmed it was free of obstruction, a few hundred little creepy crawlies excepted, although he'd had to clamber up onto the roof to remove the covering from atop the chimney. There was firewood in a woodshed outside the manor, but it was long rotted and dampened with the late autumn rains, and so Shady used the window planks instead, as well as some old newspapers for tinder. He read them thoughtfully whilst lounging by the fireplace to stay warm, as they told stories of the founding of towns that had long been imprinted into the maps of public consciousness in Equestria. Little moments of time, suspended in inkprint, soon smoldering into ash, to warm Buckwheat Manor once again. He had a daunting autumn ahead of him, but Shady felt content with his decision at the moment. He had received quite the earful from his peers when he had told them what he'd been planning on doing with his savings and his inheritance after his grandfather's passing 2 winters prior. Buying that old, condemned dump outside an ancient, quieted town in the woods in the midst of nowhere, that wasn't a young pony's ambition. Yet there was something meaningful about it to Shady. He didn't know why Buckwheat Manor had been lying forgotten for so long. He didn't know why Sunny Meadows seemed to regard it with such disdain and concern, either. There wasn't much information about the manor that he was able to dredge up among the ponies he spoke with in regards to it. It had sold abruptly shortly after the elder Buckwheat couple, the ones in the paintings no doubt, had passed. This was one of the few facts about the house he did know, and even that was barren and dubious. He wasn't given a reason why the Buckwheat children hadn't inherited the manor. Surely, as Equestria's borders expanded, as the woods around Ponyville and Canterlot grew more tamed, the Buckwheat children undoubtedly did not wish to stay cooped up in their parents' old home. It made about as much sense as any other theory Shady could come up with. Yet for one reason or another, the house hadn't sold. He had asked Sunny Meadow about it, as well as a few varying locals of Sundown, but time hadn't been kind to the home's legend. Perhaps there didn't have to be a reason. Sundown itself would have been growing around the time, and the old rickety manor past the town limits surely wasn't incredibly tempting to a blooming community. Regardless of the reason why it had been lying in wait, some part of him knew that there was a home buried deep beneath the dust and cold that held Buckwheat Manor in its grasp. Dusk fell as Shady was putting the finishing touches on his grilled carrot and potato dinner, which he deposited unceremoniously onto a flimsy camping plate and carried with him towards Buckwheat Manor, after extinguishing his stove and tucking it safely in his wagon. He ate on the porch, watching the last fringes of sunlight ebb out of the solemn sky, the air breathless and still and silent. And for but a moment, Shady felt utterly somber and alone. The sensation faded. He finished his dinner, and not wanting to play host to a hungry bear or family of raccoons through the night, took it with him and deposited it in the sink in the kitchen, which reeked of rot and lichen. He lit a fire in the library fireplace, and took to reading by the wavering light of his kerosene lamp, while darkness and cold wrapped its tendrils around Buckwheat Manor. Then he made his way upstairs, towards the master bedroom. Again, he wasn't ready to sleep on the old bed quite yet, not exactly trusting a decades-old affair to be bedbug-free after all. He set up a cot beside it instead, in such a position that it could look out the window facing the entrance drive. He had to admit, it was somewhat of an unsettling sight. The long rows of trees on either side, lit only by the pale moonlight hanging overhead. The moon was too bright for there to be any stars, and it cast the shadows of the trees in every direction across the front lawn of Buckwheat Manor. Still, he'd had a rather long day. The moment his head pressed against his cot, and his eyes closed, he could already feel sleep overtaking him. Shady was awoken abruptly by something outside the manor. He didn't know what it was, just that something outside had apparently jerked him from his slumber. Enough to wake him, but as he lay staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to come again, he was met only with the deafening stillness of the blood flowing through his own ears, as his racing heart slowed back down to normal. Curious wildlife, perhaps, something investigating his cart left outside. Cursing under his breath, Shady reached for the kerosene lamp he had left beside his sleeping cot and illuminated it. Light danced over the master bedroom and illuminated the shape of a young mare looking back at him in the half-opened door leading out into the corridor. Shady was on his hooves as though an electric current had shot through him. A ragged cry left his throat, and his hooves knocked the lantern as he started up, causing it to roll several feet away. The light danced over the room as the lantern spun, and when it came to rest, the mare was gone. Shady stared, dumbfounded. "Hello?" There was, predictably, no response. His shaking hooves found the lantern, while his eyes refused to leave the door. He tugged the light closer, leaning down to grip it in his teeth. His heart was racing in his chest, even as his nerves caught up with him, and the reality of his situation came crashing back down. A lingering nightmare. He was being ridiculous. Already the sight of the mare was beginning to fade from his mind as wakefulness seeped back into his brain. He couldn't even recall if she had been an earth pony, unicorn, or Pegasus, though for some reason he had the distinct impression that she had been quite pretty. But already her face was fading away, sent back to the realm of nightmares that had held him for a few moments too long, while his mind caught up with his body. But he sure as Tartarus wasn't going back to bed either. The manor's floor sounded out its complaints to the middle-of-the-night excursions of its new master, as Shady nervously made his way towards the hall at a creeping pace. His lantern illuminated the hall, empty, of course, up to the stairwell, before the corridor twisted and continued on in another direction deeper into the manor. Shady was quite certain that he'd have heard anything going on down the stairs, and so he vowed to investigate the top floor first. The manor had grown quite cold over the night. He had stoked the fires several hours ago, and it surely should have had enough fuel to continue burning long into the night. But he supposed he wasn't burning the highest quality firewood available. He shivered, tempted to turn back and go grab one of the blankets he tucked into his cot with, but vowed instead to keep on investigating. There was a howling outside. Quick, sudden, mournful. He almost dropped the lantern a second time before reminding himself that it was just a bloody wolf, and he would have to get used to it, living so deep in the woods. Still, his heart was beating heavily now. Shady didn't consider himself a coward before, but now he was tempted to reappraise that opinion. He hovered above the stairwell for a moment, looking down, and then, not seeing anything, continued on down the hall towards the first of the 3 bedrooms immediately to his right past the stairs. It was empty. The second bedroom was too, which left him with only the one final bedroom, and then the servants' quarters at the far end of the manor. Calmness gradually returned to him as his searches turned up nothing. No evidence besides that of his own flighty nerves. The first night in a lonely old house in the midst of the wilderness, far from civilization, and he had just been woken up by a wolf's howl outside. It was the clearest explanation for his paranoia, and hardly a radically unexpected one. He rounded the corner, and as he did, he heard the groaning of wood directly beneath him, on the first floor of the house. That sent a fresh tremor of terror through him. He certainly wasn't imagining things now, and he was quite certain he wasn't dreaming either. "Hello?" he called again, louder and more indignant than before, though the sound of his voice seemed to be muffled by the old wood and the thick motes of dust swirling around and the lamp's handle gripped in his maw. "This is private property now, I'm afraid. You're going to have to clear out." His intruder was seemingly not interested in conversing. Shady reached the stairwell down without any response to his barked-out remark, nor any further sounds of noise from within the house. As he turned the corner, though, he became aware of a few things at once. Firstly, the source of the cold became obvious, and it had nothing to do with the fire going out in the library. The double doors to the manor were wide open, the cool night air greeting his face as he descended the steps, and the front lawn came into view. The winding driveway through the orchard towards the road looked far different at night. As he came closer to the open door, he saw that a thin fog had rolled in throughout the night. The low-hanging moonlight shone like a spotlight behind sheets of night, held between the thick birches and pines towering in opposite directions. The trees stood like soldiers, rising wild and unkempt in regular intervals for the entire distance towards the rusted gate. Halfway down the walk, seeming suspended upon the fog itself, was the young mare that Shady had first awoken to. The sight was enough to unsettle Shady once more, but indignation was his more prominent emotion. Hey! He barked out, storming out onto the porch, leaving the kerosene lamp inside the house with how brightly the moon was now filling its role. The mare didn't seem to react much to his angry yell. She just looked back at him, tilted her head curiously, and said nothing. He stopped, his hooves having just left the porch and touching down on the cool dirt. They stayed like this, staring at one another, Shady passively becoming aware once again of how uncannily quiet the courtyard in front of Buckwheat Manor seemed to be, with nary even a cricket's call to sever the motionless silence. He could have been fooled into believing that him and this mare were the only living things in the courtyard of Buckwheat Manor. She was a unicorn. He could see that much now, even with much of her form somewhat engulfed by the wispy streams of fog weaving between the trees in the courtyard. Her mane was well kept, arranged in an ornate but antiquated fashion, reminding Shady instantly of the ponies depicted in the paintings back inside the manor. Her coat color and mane were both a pale, grayish white that made her look as though she existed within the fog, not apart from it. As they stared, Shady suddenly realized that the young mare was injured. Several wayward streams of brackish, inky blood were descending from a point somewhere above her forehead, streaking down the right side of her face and onto the dirt. If she was bothered by this, she didn't show it, although Shady could make out similar streaks of black beneath her eyes. Ruined mascara, dragged across the poor mare's face by some crying fit she was no longer within. Shady's mood changed instantly. His expression softened, and he thought upon his indignant barking with shame immediately. "Ma'am, are you all right? Are you out here all alone?" She continued to stare, and said nothing. Shady's heart was racing once again, as he took a step closer to the mare. Behind him, the doors to Buckwheat Manor slammed shut. Shady whipped around immediately. He had his back to the manor, having instantly discarded the idea of there being anything within after spotting the mare standing in the courtyard. But now he saw his mistake quite clearly. He could see the light of his kerosene lamp dancing about as though held, but it darted and weaved in and out of view from the windows in incredibly unpredictable, impossible manners, bobbing and weaving as though suspended in a hurricane's gale. His discarded light danced, moving from the foyer to the library and back, and then, as suddenly as it had all began, it was extinguished, and Buckwheat Manor fell back into darkness. Shady turned again. The mare was gone. Somehow, he wasn't surprised. He was certain he was dreaming, now with how rapidly his heart was beating. He expected to wake up back in his cot in the living room at any moment. But wakefulness did not come. The fog around him was growing thicker. The cold dug deep under his skin and coiled around his bones. He thought of the earlier wolf's howl, and he knew that he was a fool to be standing about in the courtyard in the dead of night. Yet there was something in his house, and somehow he had his doubts that it was a pony. The manor door was locked by the time he reached the porch. Shady cursed bitterly, knowing he had left the keys back in his jacket up in the master's bedroom on the second floor. He hadn't been expecting home invaders this early into his tenure, and it was with growing dread that he reconciled the fact that he was not quite certain how he was going to get back inside to deal with whatever was terrorizing him in the dead of night. The fog continued to thicken, rolling in from the surrounding woods. Shady fiddled with the door handle uselessly, and then peered through the library window, where he'd last seen his lamp dancing about and fading. He scanned the room from his outside vantage point, immediately seeing that the bookshelves, which had been arranged neatly despite the dust coating them, had been vivisected quite dramatically. Their contents were sprawled across the library, as though with literary malice. The fire had been extinguished, and it was only by the thin light of the moon that Shady was able to examine the room. There was movement within the manor's hall, too. He couldn't see what it was, but the shadows within were shifting. Abandoning the porch, Shady trotted around towards the back of the manor, where preliminary glances of the floor plan had told him there was an entrance into the wine cellar. It wasn't where he wanted to be blindly venturing through in the dead of night without light, but upon recalling the howling of wolves outside the manor, Shady couldn't reconcile staying outside all night either. As he made his way around the manor, Shady felt watched by its lonely, darkened windows. By daytime and from within, they had provided lovely glimpses of the shadowy forest around the manor. But now, outside, with the light of the moon now being smothered away by the thickening fog, it felt as though Shady were peering into a pure black void, encased within the skeletal structure of a house. By the time he reached the cellar door, an inclined plank of ancient wood and long-rusted hinges, his paranoia and fear had slowly been tapering away. He was mostly just growing frustrated now, the more he thought over his current situation. As far as he was concerned, there was one of a few things going on. Firstly, by some sheer, exceptionally aggravating circumstance, the very first day he moved into Buckwheat Manor was the one where some vagrants had decided to squat inside. They had found a way to trick him outside, and now were running amok within his home. It didn't quite explain the strange mare's disappearance, but Shady wasn't even sure she wasn't still lurking about in the trees somewhere, waiting for her accomplices to let her in. There was another, equally aggravating option. Some pranksters in Sundown had heard wind of some rich young out-of-towner purchasing the big old scary manor. They had waited until the sun had set, and now he was the victim to some mean-spirited game for the pleasure of a few bored locals with nothing better to do. The ponies in Sundown had seemed nice, and Shady was quite careful not to act in such a way that deserved such vitriol, and he was having a really hard time reconciling his situation with any other explanation. An old chain had been wrapped around the cellar door's handles. Shady's frustration grew, but his determination did as well, and the woodshed to Buckwheat Manor was nearby. Shady nearly tripped over a mound of dirt as he grabbed an old rusted axe from the wall of the shed and then brought it down violently onto the chain. The cellar door be damned. He was replacing the rotted wood soon anyways. He wrenched the cellar door open and was promptly met with an assault of dust. He did not care. He pushed forwards down the steps and into the cellar. The floor, which had been wood once but was now half reclaimed by dirt, was frigid and felt damp to the touch as his hooves touched down. The cellar was claustrophobically small, having just enough room for a few large oak kegs on one side and an array of canned goods on the other. There was just enough room for Shady to shuffle through, which he did blindly. At best, he could see the vaguest traces of light from beneath the closed door at the top of the stairs, and it was towards that single sliver that Shady hastily stormed towards. At the foot of the steps, his hooves became damp with a thick, liquid substance. In the darkness, he couldn't see what it was. He didn't care. He ascended the steps 2 at a time and shoved his way through the door and back into the manor. "All right, that's it," he hollered out. "Show's over!" If the intruders were intimidated, they gave no indication. Shady practically cantered towards the library, it being the last place where he had seen any degree of real movement. He stopped dead in his tracks at the entrance. Burned into the painted wallpaper of the library and half onto the bookshelves themselves was a single, blunt message, scrawled in enormous blocky letters that looked as though they had been carved with fire. The lantern. The bloody kerosene lantern that he had seen dancing about. It was tossed beneath, extinguished now, but unambiguously the culprit. He stared at the message for what felt like forever, as though he were expecting it to shift and change. And then when it didn't, he turned and began his vicious, furious search of the entire manor. He upturned ancient beds. He looked into every closet of every room. He screamed profanities at every shifting of the manor as the temperature outside continued to drop and the night continued to deepen. But his search, enthused as it was, refused to turn up anything of note or any sign of some other presence in the manor. That was, until he noticed the bloody scuff marks on the floor. He cried out in surprise instantly, but when his nerves caught up with him and his rational mind regained control, he followed them to their source. They were more prominent and more visible in the hallway above the cellar door. Much as Shady didn't want to, he brought his search back down into the cellar, this time with one of his spare lamps held tightly in his jaw. His light danced over the dirt walls of the cellar. Here, the scuff marks were fully formed hoof prints instead, ascending the steps in irregular two-step intervals. Shady froze. He looked down at his hoof and nearly used it to strike himself for his own stupidity. It was him. He was the one dragging the blackened blood around. At least that's what it looked like. He crept deeper and deeper into the cellar, and finally he found the puddle of liquid that he'd felt himself cross through when he'd first stormed through the cellar. Yet he could not seem to find a source. It was as though the puddle of oil-like, reddish liquid had come from nowhere at all, simply being placed randomly at the foot of the stairs. "Hello?" he called. He didn't realize how terrified he was until he heard his own voice. Yet there was no answer. Eventually, his search simply brought him back to the library, back to that one angrily scrawled message, still glowing with faint embers. Leave our home.